Hi, this is Doug from Dynamic Computing, and welcome to episode 39 of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast, the Romulator Review. Since time immemorial, or at least since 1985, the Amiga has used a kickstart, either a ROM or a kickstart floppy, to load parts of the operating system up before Workbench would load. With the Amiga 1000, of course, we had our kickstart disk, but starting with the Amiga 500 and Amiga 2000, we had an actual ROM chip. There's a 1.3 ROM chip right there that loads parts of the operating system before Workbench loads. The Amiga has always had somewhat of an easy upgrade path for its operating system. You pop the lid off, take out the old chip, put the new chip in, load the new operating system. Not really very difficult. The problem is that not all software has been backwards compatible. So you'd get the new OS 2.0 or 3.1 kickstarts, and suddenly your games that were designed for Kickstart 1.3 and Workbench 1.3, they don't work anymore. So in the past, people have bought ROM switchers, which fit down into the ROM socket and maybe have two ROM chips in there, and then you run a physical switch outside the case, and up is for 1.3, down is for 3.1. And those have worked pretty well over the years. But things are different in 2019. Technology has moved forward, and we have cool new things that we can use to accomplish almost the same thing. Enter the Romulator. Now, the Romulator was made from the guys at Kipper2K. Now, this is Mike Sterling and Brian Robotham that made this, and it's being distributed by Amiga on the Lake. Now, Mike did the schematics and the software, and Brian did the actual hardware implementation. The Romulator will be available exclusively from Amiga on the Lake. I'll put their link down here, and you can see their logo up on the screen. But don't worry, they do ship internationally, so there's no problem getting them no matter where you are in the world. The Romulator is a small device that plugs right into your Amiga 500, A600, or A2000. Let me show you a little bit more in detail about this little guy. Now, the first thing you may notice is that the little guy is shaped like a Star Trek Federation ship to help keep the footprint as small as possible. So on board, we have a nice little ARM chip right here. We have a 1 megabyte RAM chip. We have a voltage regulator to feed 3.3 volts to the RAM chip. There's one jumper here that will be open if you have a version 6 or version 8 Amiga 500 board, and you'll close that jumper if you have a version 3 or a version 5 board. This header here is for the reset line that connects to the keyboard header on the A500 or elsewhere on the board for an Amiga 600 or Amiga 2000. I'll show you a picture of these locations in a bit. Now, this USB header right here is fairly clever. It will allow you to hook up a cable from an external USB connector to hook your PC or Mac up to the Romulator and send kickstart files over to it without opening the case. So if you do a lot of fiddling with your kickstarts, it could come in handy. This header is also going to be used for future firmware updates. You can flash the firmware, and if they come out with new firmware, you'll be able to flash it with that USB. Now, the kickstarts themselves, they fit right on this handy dandy little flash drive. Now, there's no particular point in going with bigger than a 4 gigabyte flash drive formatted to FAT32, because there's not 4 gigabytes worth of kickstarts that are available, so it wouldn't do you any good. Most of these other connectors were used for internal design and implementation. For instance, these were used to actually program the ARM processor. These are serial connections that were used for testing things out. You won't particularly use them. Now, on the bottom, there's our SD card socket right there. On the bottom, you'll notice we have a 42-pin connector. The Amiga 500 and 2000 only use a 40-pin ROM connector. So pins 1 and 42 here, the ones closest to the saucer section of the Star Trek ship Enterprise, will not be plugged in, so you'll want to make sure that those overhang in your socket a little bit. I'll show you that when we plug it in. Now you'll notice that I have a Megachip 2 megabyte RAM expander on my Amiga 500, which is right next to the ROM socket, and normally if you just plug in the Romulator, the saucer section hits the Megachip, and it's not the best thing in the world. So here's what I did. I took a little ROM socket like this, 40-pin ROM socket, and I just stuck it right on the top of the existing ROM socket right here. You can see it right there. That elevates everything by, a centimeter or so, and now I have plenty of clearance for my ROM chip, and it doesn't seem to affect the performance at all. So let's show you how we plug this little guy in. Remember, these two pins here at the end, here and here, are going to overhang a bit, so we'll just plug in the very last pins, and then we're sure to do it. We just give a little push, and you see here the Megachip has plenty of room to breathe underneath the Romulator, and it also does not seem to be affecting the keyboard at all. Now once the Romulator is in place, it's now time to fit this little wire. This is the wire that captures the reset on the Amiga 500. And on the Amiga 500, it's super simple. Let me show you where that goes. Now here, we've got the little pin header, and what we want to do is put it in pin 3 of the keyboard connector. And it just slots down. Hard to do when I can't see. There. Slots down right inside pin 3 of the keyboard connector. That sends the reset signal back to the device. On the Amiga 2000 and the Amiga 600, it's actually going to go under one of the little resistors. You can either solder it to it or clip it to it. I will show you some pictures of that right now, where it goes. Okay, you'll notice on the Amiga 2000, it can actually just fit right underneath that little resistor, and it works just fine. You can also solder it there. And here on the Amiga 600, they recommend you solder it in place. I think getting a little chip clip thing would actually work pretty well in this circumstance too. So now that the Romulator is happily in place in the Amiga 500, let's take a look at what we do to get ROM images into it. So you take your little, say, 4 gig micro SD card, you put it in your handy dandy little adapter, and you plug it into your handy dandy little notebook or PC. Now, where do you get these ROM files from? By far, the best and most legal solution is to buy a copy of Amiga Forever from Cloanto, who also happens to be the new owners of Amiga, as I've discussed before. Here's a link to their information. Buy a copy of Amiga Forever. This thing has legal ROM files going from 0.7, which I can't get working, 1.0, 1.2, 1.3, 2.0, 2.1, 3.1. All of the previously available ROM files are there and legal. The other benefit is that they also have the ADF files for all of the versions of Workbench too. So if you want to try out Workbench 1.0, like I'm going to do here in a minute, it works absolutely fine. Now, don't you feel better knowing that you're supporting the Amiga community and an Amiga vendor, and by doing this legally? I knew you did. So let's take a look at these ROM files. If you take a look at the screen, once you download and install Amiga Forever, they're going to be in your public documents folder, in a folder called Amiga Files, and then we'll go into Shared, and we go into ROM, and look at that. All of these yummy Amiga ROMs, all perfectly legal. You're only going to want to use the ones designed for like the Amiga 500, 600, or 2000. So here we've got a 1.0 ROM, NTSC ROMs, PAL ROMs. Just take all of these files and copy them to the root of your little SD card. So let's just grab a few here. Grab that one, that one, that one, that one. 2.04. Hey, why not? Here's a 2.05 ROM. There's a 3.1 ROM, and there's even a Walker 3.2 ROM, which is kind of funny. So we'll just take these and we'll copy, and then we'll move to our little folder that has our little card in it. Here it is. You notice I've already got them all in there, and we can just paste things right into there. And it's going to overwrite them. That's fine. Now we have our Amiga ROMs in there. Now what other cool things can we do? When you purchase Amiga OS 3.1.4, you are actually buying the ROMs for it too, even if you buy just the software version of it. So you are entitled to be able to take these ROMs and burn a copy of them if you want to. So I just browsed to the folder where I actually downloaded all of these files. You see there's a folder called ROMs to burn. That's fine. This file right here will work absolutely fine. A500, A600, A2000. Just copy that over to the folder too, and you've got an Amiga OS 3.1.4 file. Now here's another brilliant thing that we can do. John, or Chucky Hertel as he's known, created this thing called the diagram, which you can burn to a real ROM chip like in this picture right here, and it will do really fantastic diagnostics on your Amiga to see what's going on with it. You can take this diagram and you can put it right on your Romulator with no issues at all. So basically we go to this diagram.com website, we go to Amiga diagram download page, and we'll just download the appropriate ROMs. Here's a stable update of the zip files of it. So once we download those, okay, I've already downloaded them to this diagram folder, and you can see inside the folder we've got a little README file. Here's an Amiga 1000, here's a 16-bit. This is the one I use right here, this diagram file. Copy that, put that in the root folder of our new little SD card, and now we've got Chucky Hertel's diagram on there. So now on our little SD card here, we have ROM images going from Kickstart 1.0 all the way up to 3.1.4. Now here's the other cool thing about this whole product. It has a 1 megabyte RAM chip on it, so you're able to put 1 megabyte ROMs right on here. So you could take your Amiga OS 3.1.4 ROM and add in the missing features, like the new Intuition library that's not on there. Throw it on there. Your Workbench libraries that are gone from there, I think it's the Icon libraries that are gone from there, because they ran out of space, you can put up to 1 megabyte of files on this virtual ROM, put it in there, work just fine. Save yourself a whole reboot, for example, if you're using the Intuition libraries in Amiga OS 3.1.4. I will put together a tutorial for doing this and showing you how to do it too. It's also critical to note that this is a product currently for the Amiga 500, the Amiga 600, and the Amiga 2000. Now the guys are working on a version for the Amiga 1200 and the Amiga 4000. It's not ready yet, and it all depends on how well this little guy sells and the public's reaction to it, whether or not they'll finish it. But that will be really cool when we can do the same thing on our Amiga 1200s and Amiga 4000s too. And remember, all of the ROM images go into the root of the SD card, not into folders, and you don't have to worry about byte swapped or non-byte swapped versions. Just put whichever one you want in there. The diagrams computer will figure out what to use. No problem at all. Now let's put this little beauty back into the Romulator, boot it up, and see what we have. And we're welcomed with a lovely mod tune provided to us by the guys at Kipper2K. Now in the future, Kipper2K wants you to be able to modify this tune and put your own mod file in there. Anything you want to, which will be kind of cool. Now the first thing you'll notice is there's all of our ROM files. There's our Amiga OS 3.1.4. There's some Eros ones I've been playing with. Amiga OS 0.7, 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 2.04, and 3.1, and then there's our diagram that I'll show you in a few minutes. Just cursor down to select your appropriate ROM file, In this case, let's go Amiga OS 1.0. Then on my GoTech, which I reviewed a couple of weeks ago, I will just set that to the Amiga OS 1.0 floppy. Once that's set, hit enter, and the Amiga boots normally. This will work absolutely fine with a real floppy drive too. You're not absolutely limited to using a GoTech. It's just really handy to do because you can just throw the OS disks on there any way that you want to. So now, here we see we've got Workbench Disk 1.0, Intuition version 1.0, and here's our lovely Workbench 1.0. This is what it must have been like when you took your Amiga 1000 home from the shop in 1985 and started playing with it. Now the first thing all of us did was go into this demos drawer and check out the cool multitasking demos that Amiga 1.0 came with. Multitasking, yay! Now we could just power down and power back up using our nice little Amiga power supply provided by Commodore Forever.net, or we can do the three-fingered salute, the regular Amiga control reset, but hold the buttons down for 3 seconds. Watch what happens. As soon as you release it after 3 seconds, you're right back in the ROM menu. This time, let's boot up Amiga OS 3.0. Switched it right on the GoTech. Now it'll boot right into Amiga OS 1.3. And we're greeted with our beautiful blue and orange workbench. Love it. And this works exactly as you would expect it to. So once you boot up into Amiga OS 1.3, everything works as you'd expect it to.
The new Romulator is really nice. Thank you, Kipper2K and Amiga on the lake.
Pretty cool, huh? Now the last one, let's just boot into Amiga OS 3.1. You can boot Amiga OS 3.1.4 to a floppy, but you have to make a special Workbench floppy for it because by default the Workbench floppy is missing some libraries. You have to move them from some of the other disks. So I won't even bother demonstrating that, but it does work. Now this Romulator works absolutely brilliantly with any kind of hard drive controller, so you can do all this from a hard drive and have it boot up in seconds instead of waiting for the floppy speeds of a GoTech. So as you can see, it boots up Amiga OS 3.1 absolutely beautifully with no problems at all, and you can do anything you want with the disk. Works absolutely great. So of course, one of the things you're going to be doing with this is using it to play games with. You can boot to Kickstart 1.3 if you need to, 1.2 if you need to for really old games. Use your floppy, use your GoTech, boot things right up. Or you can have maybe a second CF card with a whole different Amiga OS 1.3 operating system on it. Pop that in there. Boot to 1.3 when you want to, pop that out, put another CF card in, boot to Amiga OS 3.1.4. No problem at all. You don't have to mess around with kickstarts anymore because the Romulator takes care of everything. Now, let's take a quick peek at Chucky's diagram. It's really kind of cool. So we're back at our main screen. We'll just go to diagram, hit enter here. and then it's going to be working its magic, flashing the screen for a few seconds, and we come up to Chucky's really awesome diagram screen. Da-da-da-da! Sorry about the background static on there. It's my capture device. From here, we can go ahead and do things like our graphics tests, our audio tests, test all the components on the board. Now, I won't go too deeply into the diagram right now. We'll do that another time. That's worthy of an entire show. But you can test many, many components in your system, and you can make your Amiga boot to the diagram where it can't boot to anything else, which is kind of cool. Now, as soon as the Romulator boots up for the first time, it creates a file in the root of the SD drive called config.txt. In that file, you can control a timer. So you edit it on your PC, for example. You can control the timer where if you don't hit a key once the Romulator starts, after say 5 seconds, it automatically boots the last kickstart that it used, which is great because then you don't have to keep fiddling with it every time. You can change the timeout 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever. And if you hit a key to move around, it turns the timer off and you can spend as much time as you want in the menu. The other good option is you have the ability to turn on or off the background music when it plays. You just set it to false and it won't play the background music. Pretty darn amazing, right? Now, Brian and Mike worked on this thing for months, many, many months. There's been a thread on the EAB board, I'll put a link to it down in the description, that's been talking about it since I think July or August. They have some ideas. With the ability to modify the firmware on here, they're thinking of allowing us to put our own mod files on here, which would be kind of fun if you turn it on and you can have the vegetables music playing in the background if you wanted to, or whatever mod file you wanted to. Brian also has this clever idea of putting a small game in there because there's so much space available, 1 whole meg, put a little 32K Space Invaders type game on there. So when you boot directly to the Romulator, if you want to, you can play a little arcade game. It's kind of fun. Did I find any issues with the Romulator? Not really. The hardware is beautiful. The instructions for putting it together are fine. Everything about it worked great. The only issue is that it uses the reset line to go to its main screen where you choose the ROMs. So if you've got another hardware device that uses the reset line, like my precious ACA 500 Plus that I reviewed a couple of months ago, the two of them are not going to cooperate together. They're both trying to capture the reset line to get their introductory screens on there, so neither one of them really works. So I had to take my ACA 500 Plus out to do this. Now, it's not a big deal at all because the ACA 500 Plus, if you remember from my review video, has the same features where you can take a ROM file and force the ACA 500 Plus to boot to that ROM file using its own memory. So the features are actually duplicated, so it doesn't affect me at all. And the Romulator will work with 99% of the other accelerators out there because they don't capture that reset line, so you can configure it before the system ever boots. So it's just an issue with this one product, not a big deal. Well, who is this for? Who's this designed for? Well, anybody who wants to run old software is really what it's designed for, without having to swap out your ROMs. You're having all kinds of fun with the new Amiga Os 3.1.4, and your favorite game just doesn't boot because of the kickstart. Instead of using a switch to switch between them or swapping out your ROM chips or whatever, of course we can also use WHD load, but this allows you to boot to another Kickstart ROM, no problem at all. For historical reasons, it's also a lot of fun. A lot of us in the Amiga community like to play with the history, the things that the Amiga could do with this version of the operating system or that version of the operating system. This way, if you want to load up Kickstart 1.0 and Workbench 1.0 and play with it and see what it's like, great. Have fun. Do it all day long. No problem at all. The ROMs can be switched with a couple of keystrokes. Also really going to be useful for what I already mentioned with the Amiga OS 3.1.4 for putting all of the missing libraries back into a big ROM file, using the Romulator and bypassing the extra reboot and probably making things a little bit faster too. That's going to be fun to try out. And lastly, using it as a diagnostic tool. You can get your own ROM burner and burn the diagrams, no problem at all. You can buy them already burned for like 25 bucks. But if you have the ability, while you're doing everything else, to have your diagram right on your Romulator, pop it out, pop it in another Amiga 500 you're testing, you're good to go. You're golden, no problem at all. And then you don't have to swap it out when you go to actually try and boot it up with a real ROM chip. It's right there on the Romulator, no big deal. It's extremely easy to install on the Amiga 500. It literally took me like 2 minutes to do it, no problem at all. Biggest issue I had was I had to bump up the size of my ROM chip so it didn't hit the mega chip. Most of you won't have that problem because most of you probably don't have mega chips in there. It would be nice on the Amiga 2000 and the Amiga 600 if they made that a little easier with one of those little chip clips you can use to just snap it on and grab onto like a resistor. It would probably make it easier than having to slide it under there and, you know, get your soldering iron out and make a permanent solder mark. Just include a chip clip. Things would be great. Now, when will this little gem be available? Well, in theory, as soon as this video is over and I let Jeff and Aaron at Amiga on the Lake know that it's live, they're going to release it on the website. So early next week, whenever, you'll be able to order your own Romulator from Amiga on the Lake. Again, there's their website right down there. No worries, because they do ship internationally, so that's not an issue. You can get it any place in the world. And there's no issue NTSC or PAL. It works in all the machines just fine. The retail price is $79.95, which really isn't all that bad, considering the Romulator is an actual computer that sits in your ROM socket. It's not just a couple of little circuit boards. It's an actual ARM processor that's handling everything. And they had to code it, they had to program it, get it figured out how it's going to work. All that's worth some money. So I think the $80 price tag is perfectly reasonable. It's certainly more reasonable than buying your own ROM burner and then having to track down your own 40-pin ROMs and trying, successfully or not, to burn ROMs over and over to test things out. I will easily give this little guy 4.75 Amiga checkmarks out of 5. It would get 5 Amiga checkmarks without a doubt if they made it so you could configure the settings for the Romulator within the interface instead of having to take the SD card out and edit it in another computer, put it back in. If you could just edit the settings right on the screen, that would be fantastic. And if they decided to include a little chip clip to make it easier to work in an Amiga 2000 or an Amiga 600, then 5 out of 5 once they do that. Now, I will be demoing this in my Amiga at the Amy West show in October of this year, October of 2019. So if you want to see it in action, go to amywest.net and find directions to get to the show, and I'll be having a demo of it right there. So I encourage you to stop by and say hi. I'm going to have a lot of cool stuff going on. I'm going to have my video toaster there. I'll have the Romulator. I'm going to be giving demos of the new Black Dawn Rebirth game from Double-Sided Games, and I'm going to be showing off my new Checkmate case from Stephen Jones too. So please like and subscribe if you like this video. Follow me on Twitter at 10mark1, okay? But until next time, this is Doug from 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast, signing out to go play some more vegetables. It doesn't use the joystick, it uses the mouse. Good thinking, Doug.